Just a little bit of introduction to the book of Esther. Um, there was quite a bit of writing and commentaries. I mean, it's a huge amount, which I was surprised at. Esther seems like a book that we give little attention to, but I think it's something we need to look at quite a bit. But as far as the author, some thought Ezra or Nehemiah, but there's no real evidence about that they wrote the book. Some cited Mordecai because of his firsthand knowledge of the events that happened. But the best position that I came down to, we don't know who wrote Esther. Sometimes that's the best answer. As far as the title, the main character in the book owns the title of the book. The Persian name Esther means star, and it referred to the goddess Ishtar in their homeland. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah, and it means myrtle, which God uses that as an illustration of the beauty of Israel when he redeems her from exile in Isaiah 53 or 55. Mordecai's name is derived from Marduk, the lord of the Babylonian gods. So when we hear these names and hear all this kind of reference to the Babylon and the gods of there, it kind of lends itself to the problems with the book. The events in Esther take place in Susa, the capital city of Persia, somewhere between 483 to 473. The Persian king mentioned in the book was Xerxes, also known as, I can't say these names, Ahasuerus, who reigned from 486 to 464. And Xerxes had a banquet that occurred in the third year of his reign, and Haman's plot that we'll refer to in a moment began in his 12th year. So if you read the book, it sounds like it's all jumbled up, but it's quite a span of time in this story. The audience was the people of Israel and Palestine and Persia. That's important because these are the people that did not go back to help rebuild the temple, did not go back to the homeland to help with that process. Those Jews in Palestine were facing all kind of turmoil and trouble, as you read in Nehemiah and in that rebuilding phase. The temple took over 21 years to complete, and Ezra's writings tell the nation's poor spiritual health, which lines up with the story of Esther, poor spiritual health of God's people. Esther's story would have been told to encourage them not to fear the nations, but to trust God and obey his commands. That would have been kind of the purpose of it. There's a historical timeline surrounding this story. Judah's exiled to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar, and then King Cyrus of Persia defeated the Babylon king, took over his empire. King Cyrus issued a decree that the Jewish exiles could return to their homes, which many of them did. The first group of exiles went with Ezra and returned to Jerusalem. They were led by Zerubbabel, Sheshbazzar, and Jeshua. Jerusalem's temple was rebuilt under the exhortation and encouragement of Haggai and Zechariah. The events in the book of Esther take place during this brief period of the Persian domination, which didn't last very long in the world. The king Xerxes was assassinated eventually by his bodyguard, according to history. This is the one we're dealing with in this story. It's interesting that in Isaiah 48 and 52 and Jeremiah 58, the people were commanded to return by the Lord's command to rebuild the temple, but this is the group of people that chose not to. They remained in Persia, including Mordecai and Esther. Let's see. Then the Nehemiah story comes in during this time and his return to Israel. The key things to think about when you're looking at Esther is the idea of an edict or a law. Edicts of the Persian kings were binding, they could be amended but never canceled. So when a Persian king gave an edict, it had to stay. It was like there to stay. Glad that's not always true for our world. Jewish people that remained in the land were persecuted by Haman and protected by God. The feast events, the Feast of Purim is the one we'll get to in a little bit that concludes this story. Let's see. That's pretty much it. As far as the outline of Esther, if you just a brief outline and just kind of going through the story. What do you think of this king, just off the top of your head, if you read Esther? What do you think about this king?
Haughty.
Huh? Haughty. The good word for it. He kind of full of himself, wasn't he? He throws a celebration for who? For himself. Yeah, he gave himself a party for 180 days. Okay? During this party, he sends for the queen to show her off, basically, to bring her. She was, if I understand the story right, she was having a ladies' party and he was having a guys' party. And he asked her from the ladies' party to come so he could show her off to the rulers and the people that had gathered to honor him. And what does she do? She don't want nothing to do with it. You understand that, right? Yeah. Then, to just summarize the story a little bit, the king gets with who? All the men in the community. And what do you remember they said? If you lose control of that woman, I'm going to lose control of my woman. We're all going to lose control of our women, and man, we're going to be in chaos. So that was basically the discussion. So he decides not to let her get away with it. The queen loses her position, and the king reinforces the rule. Actually, makes an edict that men shall rule the home. Okay, interesting. By the way, Esther has no mention of God in the book. There's allusions to it. There's no mention of it. It almost didn't make the Jewish canon, almost didn't make the Christian canon because of that. It's kind of it was seen as more about the culture than about God. So, but it made the canon. But that was the interesting part of looking at some of the commentaries. But you have this wicked king character, and what happens when the queen decides not to be queen or goes up against the king? He gets a new queen. And if you remember the story, all this pomp and ceremony goes into getting all these ladies fixed up and made up and all this. I can't remember the exact number of days they had to go through this process to get prepared for the king. And then it's like a Miss America contest or something. They all come in and have their time, and he chooses one of those to be his bride, his new queen, and that's Esther. Mordecai, his whole family had been carried away into exile. He brought up his cousin because of her family was gone, and it's who? Esther. He's bringing her up as his own child, living in his home, takes her in as an orphan. Her captivity name was Esther, which means beautiful. She's brought into the harem and given beauty treatments. Mordecai had forbid her to reveal her origin. He didn't want her to tell anybody that she was of Jewish origin. Esther was so impressive that the king made her queen. After this, Mordecai discovers a plot to assassinate the king and exposes this through Esther. So all these kind of things kind of build on each other. Then there's a villain in this story. You may remember the name of the villain? Haman. Haman's given honor and authority. Mordecai would not bow down to him, appealing to his being a Jew and not bowing down to a person. Haman begins to conspire of a way to get rid of the Jews, all the Jews, because of that. He convinces the king to sign an edict to destroy all the Jews on a certain day. So he kind of uses his influence to influence the king to try to get rid of the Jewish people. But then in chapter 4 and 5, Mordecai hears of this and he starts mourning in sackcloth and ashes, and a lot of the other Jews did as well when they heard of it. It's kind of a nationwide repentance. Esther sees this and sends one of her servants, because she's in the king's harem now, sends one of her servants to see what's going on. Mordecai informs her through the servant and encourages her to take this to the king. Probably the focus of our lesson this week was Esther 4:9 through 15. I was going to go ahead and read that in its context here from where we're at. Hathach is the servant. I can't know if I'm saying that right. Hathach went back and reported to Esther that what Mordecai had said, beginning of verse 9. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman to approach the king in the inner court without being summoned by the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but you have been come to the royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. How does that strike you? What does that say to you about Esther? Committed, brave. Did she know the possibilities? So sometimes we have this concept that having faith means not having fear. I don't think so. She knew the consequences. She knew if she went in and he didn't give her the scepter, she's like the former queen all of a sudden. So this is a story of faith, the faith of a woman in using her position to glorify God. She requests a banquet with the king and Haman. What does Haman think is going to happen? The queen wants me at a banquet. Okay. So Haman's not a whole lot different than the king, right? They're all kind of full of themselves. In the meantime, Haman makes plans to execute Mordecai, and I'm going to read that Esther 5, beginning in verse 10. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, calling together his friends, and this is after he saw Mordecai. Mordecai didn't respond to him. His wife. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, all the ways the kings had honored him, and how he had elevated him above all the nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I am the only person Queen Esther invited to the company of the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet tall and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. Okay. The interesting thing in this story happens right now. What's the king doing? There's a side that comes up. What's the king doing at this time in this story?
wants to honor somebody.
He wants to honor somebody. Okay? And he discovers that need to honor somebody because he can't sleep. What does he do when he can't sleep? He looks at his records about himself. Okay? He's looking at the chronicles of his kingship. And what does he discover as he's not sleeping and having trouble sleeping and reading the chronicles of his history? Somebody did him a favor, and he didn't get any recognition, and that's where Jim's place comes in. This guy needs to be recognized because what did he do? He kept assassination attempt from happening of the king. So he says, "Oh, we got to do something about this," and basically has Haman do what? This is hilarious, isn't it? What does he have Haman do? Basically sets up a parade for Mordecai. Yeah, he has a little parade through town honoring this guy that he wants to kill and put on after he had the gallows built to basically get rid of him. Yeah, it's a flip. Yeah. And so you got this reversal of fortune that happens with this story. And then basically Esther goes to the king, takes a chance. What does the king do? Offers her a scepter. She comes in, has this conversation with the king. What do you remember about an edict? Can't change an edict, but what did the king do? Do you remember the story? He said, okay, I can't stop that from happening, but what am I going to allow? I'm going to allow the Jews to defend themselves to the man and take care of their national security. So he basically gives them permission to defend themselves, which takes away this annihilation principle because they wouldn't have had an attempt to defend themselves. And then the Jews defend themselves. All the enemies of the Jews are defeated, including Haman's sons. They're destroyed. And basically, after that, all that Haman had wanted to happen to Mordecai happened to him. He's hung on the gallows. His family's destroyed. And that kind of summarizes the story of Esther. I want to kind of close it, read the ending of this story. Man, we got 5 minutes left. Is that right? Mm-hmm. The greatness of Mordecai, and look at 10:1. King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores. All acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, and they are not written in the book of the annals of the king. Are they not written in the books of the annals of the king of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. And then the Feast of Purim, we're told, is to be celebrated annually on the 14th day of Adar, which is February to March area. And the word Purim is taken from the Persian word pur, which means lot, because Haman cast lots to decide what day he wanted to destroy the Jews. So that's interesting in all that the Purim is set up in the feast. But here's what I want you to understand about the book of Esther. All these things happen in a succession all the way down to where it seems like it's the darkest hour for the Jewish nation, not the Jewish nation in general, but those that were there in Persia. It looked like the end was here. It was imminent. We're all going to die. Let's just mourn this thing, and then what happens? Everything that happened here comes back and happens into the other side of the equation. And then Mordecai is honored. the man who set out to be destroyed is honored. Isn't that kind of a cool story when you think about it? There are a few takeaways that I wanted to leave from this story, and I'll go ahead and get into those. Even when life looks at its most chaotic, even when things look darkest, what's the potential? God comes through. Now, we can use that as a principle. Is it always true? No. Sometimes things get bad, and maybe in another life things will get better. But in this case, God comes through in the chaos, and He often does. And the other thing was, in reality, this group of people were a disobedient group of people, weren't they? Where were they supposed to be? They're supposed to be in Jerusalem. They're not. And we would kind of think, well, God won't look out for them, but He does. What does that say about the faithfulness of God? Even when we're not faithful, God is. So He continues to work for the disobedient. I had some references to that, but we don't have time. If you want these references, I'll give them to you. The other thing was that God will find a way to accomplish His will. I thought it was interesting what Mordecai says to Esther. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. If you remain silent, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. If she hadn't done it, God would use somebody else. God will accomplish what He needs to accomplish, whether we participate or not. And the other thing was that I thought was interesting in this story was God's working and nobody knows it. The king sitting there can't sleep, reading his history, and discovers Mordecai. You think that was random? Okay. God works even when we can't see it. Was one of the things that kind of came to my mind. And then to follow God is more important than personal gain or glory, which was the point of our lesson. Esther says, I will go to the king even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. That's faith. And the last thing, which kind of an odd thought that came to my mind, is the one who receives the accolades is not always the hero of the story. Who received all the accolades at the end of the story? Mordecai. Was he he kind of facilitated some things among the people, but who's the hero of the story? Esther. So I think that kind of lends itself to our thought about encouraging people, even though they're not in the limelight, I guess you'd call it. Being people that see the works of people and honor them. So, any other thoughts about the book or anything that came?
As I read the book of Esther, it seemed like the whole book is what these guys did. Mordecai, Haman, and what these guys did. But it's the woman behind all.
She's the hero of the story. She's the one the book's named after.
Look upon is all that great about it.
Yeah.
So they had to tell us what all these guys were doing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was Esther, and God's not mentioned. But they fasted and they did all these things that people would have
demonstrates
done.
dependent.
And you could see God at work in all.
Yeah, and that's a good thing about the book. And possibly that means for us to be on the lookout for God where we don't necessarily expect Him. Yeah, good stuff. Any other thoughts?
You can also think about she was Mordecai explained to her that she really didn't have an option. She was going to die,
one way or
one
another.
way or the other.
That's a good point.
It just shows that she chose the right,
Mhm.
the right road.
And that was the point Roger pointed out about this lesson's point was to choose the right thing. That's a very good, well made point in the leader's guide. Any other thoughts? Good stuff, guys.
Not this book, this is Dre's book. Anyway, in the classroom, it was something about what did you think the way they arranged for Vashti to be kicked out and then bring all these other women, the other women have a choice? No. They had no choice, they had to go because the king picked them, or somebody or the king picked them. It was like several hundred, I think, women. And I was reading when you said, I think it's about 18 months of preparation.
Yeah, I couldn't remember.
I looked it up and he said that. And he would, filter out, did he judge them? Did somebody else judge them? And it also mentioned something about, would that be considered trafficking?
Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah.
And they did that there. I mean, to me, thinking about this and how the society then used women, well, particularly used women, God still picked her out above everybody else. She was important.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was what the point I was trying to make at the end of about she's the hero. Yeah, she's the one that God used. Mordecai did his thing and it was all good stuff, but yeah, she was the kind of the hero of the story. I want to end with this part in the book, in the Leader's Guide. God has warned his people of all the consequences of breaking his covenant. When they turned from God, they also turned away from his blessing and protection. They placed themselves under a curse. God even warned them that he would scatter them with violence. The curse deported many of them to Babylon, placed all of them within the reach of Haman's hatred. Yet even a disobedient people remain God's people. His loving kindness to them comes from his very own character. To Abraham, he promised blessing for the whole world through Jews. God called them forth to bless the world and to serve as a channel through whom the Messiah would come. Nations and groups who raised their hands against God's people raised them against God himself. They placed themselves in opposition to God, and their hatred will produce its own disastrous consequences. The Jews found themselves in Haman's power because their great-grandfathers had forsaken God. The choices we make in our generation will help shape the future and the situation of our offspring as well, in ways that we cannot foresee. Let us choose that we will lead God with God's blessing and protection. I thought that was a good point made in the book. So, any other thoughts? We're out of time. Thanks.